All right, thanks for joining us. We have Amanda and Jessica here with us today. Region 5 was chosen as part of an EDA opportunity for this New Growth Innovation Network data opportunity. And we are really excited to share the reports with you and the findings that Amanda and Jessica have for us. So I'm gonna turn it over to them.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for having us. We are really excited to have worked with Region 5 on this kind of first part of this project. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction on who NGIN is to start us off, and then I'll let Jessica talk about the Inclusive Recovery Initiative, and then we'll get into some of the data. So New Growth Innovation Network, we go by NGIN is our handy acronym. We're a knowledge, insight, and innovation hub. Essentially, we work to support economic development practitioners and how they embed equity and inclusive economic development principles into their overall work. And so we're really focused on how we can support regions to better create economic opportunities for people of color, women, and untapped geographies. And so through this, we've been working on the Inclusive Recovery Initiative, which Region 5 has been a part of. I'm going to let Jessica talk about this program and kind of one component of it, and then I'll jump back into the technical assistance and data.
Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to virtually meet everyone and to be able to share this amazing opportunity and partnership that we've been able to develop with EDDs across the US, and particularly with y'all at Region 5. Jessica Gonzalez, I'm an Inclusive Economic Development Advisor and co-leading this project. My part of the project is building out and supporting a community of practice of economic development district practitioners to help them think about embedding economic inclusion in the work that they do, particularly in the SEDS. And you'll hear a little bit more about that in the slides to come. The Inclusive Recovery Initiative is the initiative that we have launched in support with financial support from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, the EDA, particularly the RNTA program, to really help support EDDs to think about how not only to think about the work that they're doing in economic resiliency, yet at the same time looking at equity as a catapult to inclusive economic development. Next slide. And so an overview of this project is there's three fundamental outcomes that we'd like to say is driving our work in not only the community of practice, but also the technical assistance component. And so one of those is how do we drive inclusive growth and support EDDs to think about inclusive growth, not only as a means to build economic well-being in the region, but also to look at each member of the community equally and equitably in contributing to that growth and in putting them at the forefront of their solutions and seeing them as assets. The second component is COVID-19 recovery. A lot of this conversation has been catapulted because of the impacts of the pandemic, how the pandemic has not only put pressures on our local economies, but also made us think more innovatively of how do we look at not only our industries, but also the people that make our communities vibrant. And then the last component is the what. The what is it that we are trying to influence and support, and that is the SEDS, the strategic planning document that EDDs own in order to guide them over a period of time, 5 years or so, in what they should be focusing on to help revitalize, support, and drive their economy, and how do they make their strategies more actionable by using an inclusive economic development approach. Next slide. And so as I shared, the community of practice is a component that I oversee. Currently, we have a community of practice of 85 practitioners scaling across 34 states and 52 organizations. And so it's a pretty hefty group of people, and they have been on quite a journey. What NGIN has fundamentally built out for them is a community network where folks can tap into an online platform to not only engage and connect with practitioners across other EDDs and have contact information, put a face to skills, et cetera, but also have access to learning resources and content. We have facilitated up to 4 convenings. And so we have touched upon not only what place does race and equity have in the conversation of economic development, looking at language as a practice of catapulting that work. How do we look at our data analysis through an anti-bias lens? And also, how do we design community engagement strategies that focus on designing towards justice? And the next couple of convenings that we'll be touching upon include inclusive capital, human capital, and finally, we'll share with the entire community practice the technical assistance findings. We've activated peer-to-peer sessions where peers can learn directly from each other. And we've also coordinated direct NGIN support systems so we can be available to EDDs and in the practitioners in our community practice with knowledge sharing and just thought sharing and thought leadership. And so with that, that's the community of practice. I'm going to pass it over to Amanda to talk about the technical assistance package as well as our findings for Region 5.
Thanks, Jessica, for kind of laying that foundation for the program. So Region 5, we were excited to work with you as one of 6 organizations that we chose to receive the more in-depth technical assistance package. We chose kind of one from each economic development region across the country and tried to get a good mix of urban cities and mid-sized cities and rural areas as well. In regions that are at different stages in kind of their journey of embedding equity into their work as well, in order to get insights that can be applied across a lot of different regions. So what we're doing as part of the technical assistance, this is kind of the package. There are kind of 3 key phases. The analysis phase, where we've done a deep dive on data, looking at what are the economic disparities within the region, how might COVID have impacted those, and where are some kind of opportunities to support more inclusive growth within each of the 6 regions that we've identified. And then we're really kind of moving right now into the planning stage, which is identifying those findings and recommendations. We've kind of rolled up through this presentation some initial opportunities, and some of the analysis reports that we provided had some clear recommendations as well. We're going to kind of refine those into a document that we'll be able to provide you that'll be kind of a standalone plan that you guys can use. And then lastly, we want to identify one really strong recommendation that we're going to look at laying the foundation for implementation. And so that can be something that looks at, a program design, a program build, or capacity building, but really kind of kicking off and supporting a project on the ground that will influence inclusive growth within the region. And so to kind of dig into Region 5 on the analysis phase, we looked at these kind of 3 key reports or parts of the analysis that we did for the Region 5 region. The first one is baseline analytics. This report we provided for all of the region, and it just kind of gave us a good way of laying the foundation for kind of what the existing economy looks like, what are the existing demographics within each region, and kind of getting a baseline understanding. And then through discussion with Cheryl and Erica, we kind of refined these 2 specific topics that we wanted to dig into in particular. One being small business impacts with a focus in this region on agriculture as well. And then really looking at kind of rural main streets. And so we did some additional analysis of kind of how COVID could impact rural main streets, particularly in Region 5 in one area, but also broadly kind of what the trends are with rural main streets and what are some kind of ways to support continued growth for rural regions. So I'm going to dig into, share a lot of data points on the next few slides, and then kind of hopefully summarize them into some key findings. So for baseline analytics, we really looked at population growth, demographics, what are some of the kind of difference in equity indicators across demographics. And this report also had some industry trends, which I don't have specific data points pulled out, but I will talk about later as well. So we saw within the region that there is, a slight population growth, which is actually a little bit more than for some of the individual counties, but overall, slight growth, and we dig into that kind of in the rural piece as well. But most significantly to point out, a lot of that population growth has been those identifying as two or more races and within the Hispanic or Latino residential population. So there are a couple of things to kind of think about with that. I think there has been a growth in 2 or more races, but also how people identify shapes this data. It's really kind of an interesting trend, but one we've seen really in every single region that we've looked at as far as BIPOC populations really driving the population growth in many of these regions. We even see often white population maybe shrinking compared to other populations in the region. What I do want to point out on this slide, and I'm going to dig into a little bit more on the next one, is there is a real difference between median household income across counties in the region and across demographics, but it doesn't always fall the way you might think it is. And I think that's a really interesting thing to point out, and I'll talk about that on the next slide. There are significant kind of equity indicator differences between demographics, and so I wanted to point out for those who own their own home, it's much more likely that white households in the region own their own home than Black households, which is significant because we know that home ownership is really a way for many people to generate wealth. Not being able to own your home means you can kind of be more susceptible to economic shocks or a loss of income or the things that people struggled with during COVID are much more impactful for those who don't own their homes. So we know that that's a really important equity indicator to keep in mind. And then lastly, I wanted to point out something that we saw pretty significantly is the real low educational attainment for the Hispanic and Latino population in the region, particularly when it comes to the post-secondary education achievement. So digging into that income piece, I wanted to point out, so we pulled out kind of income by race across the counties. And there are some really interesting trends I wanted to point out here, and just that one struggle always is lack of data, and we weren't able to get these numbers for every county, for every demographic, but you can tell that there are significant differences really for income with the Black population. However, across the Hispanic population, it really varies. So you can see in Crow Wing County that there is actually, and also in Cass County, significant high incomes for the Hispanic and Latino population in the region. And I think that's a function of the total population in those regions, but also, digging into that and understanding what those economic opportunities are in those particular counties could be, an ongoing kind of area of analysis. And it is also interesting and another area of analysis could be interesting, particularly with Asian population. We see often that they tend to have a higher median household income, but there tends to be a lot of differences between different demographic groups within Asians, whether it's Chinese Americans or Vietnamese Americans. So looking at those differences, especially within Asian, Hispanic, or Latino populations, might be of interest to kind of explore this even deeper. So these are kind of the 3 critical findings I pulled out from this report. I kind of already talked about this, seeing the kind of growth in BIPOC population in the region as really a significant driver of the population growth. So in 2010, Hispanic and Latino, non-white Hispanic Latino populations only were 6% of the population, but it's now 10% as of 2020 census. And so understanding kind of, when you look at those economic disparities, understanding that as Hispanic and Latino population becomes a larger component of your population, you really want to look at how you're providing access to economic opportunities to those groups. And this is kind of emphasized in the second point, which is really looking at the kind of income variations across the region, understanding, inequity not only as a function of race, but also of geography. And so understanding where those economic opportunities are and where more support might be needed, and understanding kind of those large differences in home ownership and educational attainment across demographic groups. And then the one industry point I kind of wanted to talk about specifically related to the pandemic, we're highlighting kind of where the employment losses were. Typically in information, wholesale and retail trade, and transportation and warehousing. Retail trade not being surprising, we've seen that a lot, but I think it's interesting to note that most of these industries, with the exception of that one, were actually already declining. So understanding some of that economic structure and what industries continue to need support post-pandemic to continue recovery is critical. So I'll get into the kind of the small business side of data, which is particularly interesting, particularly as Region 5 has a lot of small businesses. Over 93% of the businesses within the region have less than 50% or have less than 50 employees, and 46% have less than 5 employees. So it's a big piece of the economy. And even if when you look at this point right below, the percent of the workforce that works at those small businesses, while we expect that to be kind of smaller than the total number of small businesses, it is a significant part of the economy as far as the percentage of workers that are working at those businesses with less than 50 employees. But when we look at kind of diversity and ownership, we see that kind of women and BIPOC business ownership is really underrepresented as kind of a percentage of the population overall, and really compared to kind of national trends. And I think that's something to keep in mind. Most of the small businesses in the region are in retail or construction, kind of an interesting point. And you see kind of through the PPP loans, which I think as a kind of function of how the region was able to get kind of external support for your businesses during the pandemic, we see that most of those loans went to construction and healthcare and manufacturing businesses. And so I think there's you know, a question mark of how retail businesses continue to fare and whether or not they had access to funding during the pandemic as well. So some of those critical findings from the small business report that I'll kind of hit on again. So women and BIPOC really underrepresented in business ownership in the region. I think this is something that you know, we can think about as far as recommendations. What are the tools and things that women and people of color who want to own businesses need more support in, whether it's access to capital or access to, you know, infrastructure and that sort of thing, that would kind of support that, is something that we get into recommendations to consider. And then once again, emphasizing that the retail trade industry has the most small businesses in the region, but only received 9.6% of the PPP loans. And so that's kind of an area of gap that might be needed to address. Pre-pandemic, some of the small businesses that we saw kind of losing or shrinking as far as a percentage of kind of what small businesses are in the region are in education and ag, forestry, fishing, and hunting. So as we look kind of at the agriculture industry, understanding that the small businesses in that industry have been shrinking, really pre-pandemic is an interesting point of kind of thinking in assessing the ag industry overall. But interestingly enough, when you look at actually employment losses within ag industry, which we did kind of a call out in this report about, there weren't significant employment losses. Really, most of that was combined percentage-wise into kind of very niche areas of the ag industry. And so kind of understanding the dynamics there of kind of what maybe specific industries or what specific types of businesses might need more support post-pandemic in the ag industry is something to dig in deeper as well. So the last piece of the report was really looking at rural main streets. And one thing, and I'm glad I had these percentages because I wanted to point this out earlier. So the city of Brainerd, we dug into rural main streets as kind of a function of rural economies and kind of a draw and what really rural main streets provide to small downtowns and small rural areas. And we've seen, you know, historically and across the US kind of a decline in population in rural areas, and understanding how that affects those rural downtowns is really critical. So we pulled out some data specifically on the city of Brainerd and on Crow Wing County to kind of, you know, examine this kind of interesting dynamics. So while the city of Brainerd has seen population loss over the last 10 years, the county and the region overall have grown. And so interestingly, kind of put that in the context of some of this question that we're asking about whether or not main streets are really drawing in people and can continue to do that, is kind of the fundamental question we were trying to ask. And so we put together this, I want to have to give out a short shout out to our partner, Fourth Economy, who has kind of developed this model that looks at kind of what could be the impacts to small town main streets of people who are now working from home instead of working in those downtown areas. So we know that people who are coming into a downtown, who are eating at restaurants, who are buying at shops, they're contributing to the economy and the small businesses. And I think this is a critical question Cheryl asked in kind of our first conversation is, do we know what has been the impact to those communities that are now kind of dealing with people who are more likely to work from home? And we know that remote work can also be a boon for rural areas and providing kind of economic opportunities, and people can come to those areas that might have a very specific job that used to tie them to a particular community, but kind of how do those kind of differing trends kind of play out? And so Fourth Economy actually developed this model that used census data that kind of ties people to a place of work to really kind of consider how might people change their habits and what could that impact be to a region's downtown. And so we looked at the area of kind of Baxter in the downtown area of Brainerd. We combined a couple of zip codes because the Brainerd one is a little big, so we kind of had to cut it off. But we looked at the businesses in arts, entertainment, recreation, accommodation, food services, other services, those kind of service Main Street businesses that we see. And there's a significant number of these in the downtown area, right? We saw 336 small businesses, 2,261 employees, representing $410 million in annual revenue. And so what we did was looking at the propensity of certain occupations and their ability to work from home. And if for 50% of the workers who, based on their job, would likely be able to work from home, what would the decrease in demand for those kind of services and businesses and revenue be? And it's estimated it could impact between 30 small businesses, 90 employees, and $16.6 million in annual revenue. So emphasizing this is a forecast, but I think it's an interesting exercise to understand kind of how much those workers coming into your downtown really impact your economy overall. So to kind of dig into that and kind of summarize it, I guess. Emphasizing that kind of in line with national trends that we see for small rural towns, the city of Brainerd has seen this kind of declining population despite this growth that we've seen in the county and region. And understanding kind of that there are these potential impacts to downtown areas that can be added from additional remote work in those rural areas, and those people in the rural areas no longer coming into those downtown main streets. And so if you see that kind of propensity in those people, 50% of eligible workers we can see a significant impact. And I think the critical piece of this that we discussed and kind of came in the recommendations is that it really emphasizes the need to identify ways to revitalize and reinvigorate these main street areas, to mitigate the impact of decreased traffic, to give kind of people reasons to continue to come into downtown. And I think there's ways to do that that also kind of go to the point of supporting small retail businesses in your community and some of those other objectives that we've seen from the analysis. So that's kind of the bulk of the data. I know Cheryl shared those reports with you, but there's a ton more highlights in there as well. But to really summarize, I pulled out a couple of opportunities, and we've continued to talk about what these areas are for what we kind of identify as some recommendations. But we really see support for rural main streets, particularly small retail trade businesses, as a key component and a key recommendation that we would want to make. I think identifying growth areas in the ag industry and also opportunities to upskill workers for economic mobility is something that we talked about in particular in the agriculture report that I think continues to be a recommendation. And then I also want to highlight kind of the high wage growth industries in the region, in particular being finance and insurance is another way to continue to kind of support the kind of inclusive growth principles within the region. So our next steps really, we've talked about convening additional stakeholders, I think, for your region, sharing these kind of findings with more stakeholders is really the objective in order to make sure that we're getting feedback on kind of what we've heard overall. And this is kind of part of that process. And then I'm kind of going to identify and pull out 3 to 4 of these strategies and recommendations that we'll highlight in this kind of final document that we'll present to you. And then I know that one key piece of this is really making sure that these recommendations align with the SEDS plan in order to make sure that this equity is really embedded into what you guys are doing as you move forward. So like I said, the outcome really documenting the critical findings, recommendations, serving at this kind of foundation for inclusive recovery, And then the exciting part is identifying that kind of one strategy, that one piece of work that aligns with kind of these recommendations and your guys' program and project initiatives that we can continue to support for the implementation stage of the project. So with that, I think we have time for questions if anybody has any. We really appreciate your time.
Wow, Amanda, that was quick and good. Thank you so much. Jessica, too. Great job, ladies. Just a couple things that struck me, and that I'd love for team members to lean into this at all, even with just observations, is that I think it'd be cool to better understand in the future why fewer Black-owned households are in our region, and what are the causes of that statistic that you shared, that data. That would be interesting to understand. And then it would be also good to know what we can learn from the counties that have BIPOC equitable incomes, because it's fascinating that some of our counties are, some of our minority populations are doing well. And so what were the strategies of those counties deployed to, or did that happen naturally? Or, was there strategy involved in that approach, or not, would be I guess a further deeper, a little bit of research. It'd be fun to hear from economic development folks from across the region, or county commissioners, or others who might have answers to some of those questions.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And maybe it is, particular strategies, but overall just kind of digging into kind of what the economic opportunities are in those counties that have higher incomes for BIPOC households would be interesting kind of to explore.
One of the things I really appreciated from the Inclusive Recovery Initiative is that you, in this report, and thank you for both reports. There's this great one around downtown Main Street stuff, and then there's a great one about general, and then there's good information about ag. And so much of what you guys spoke to leans into initiatives and projects that we're proposing at Region 5 or pursuing. And so that's really good to see. We might be on the right track in some cases. But I would love for anyone to go on our website and take a look at the in-depth reports, because you give recommendations, ideas of what others from the network are doing, or things that you've experienced from other economic development districts across the nation, for us to consider as strategies for the SEDS, strategies for our own organization and our partners. And so I appreciated that it wasn't just a data dump. It said, given this data and this approach, here's some ideas for consideration of your leadership and your residents. So that was really cool. But I'll mute there and see if team members have comments about either the process, the reports, or next steps.
Well, I guess I was curious about sharing with everyone about the data itself and COVID data in general, and how that's been a challenge in some ways. I wonder if you just want to share a little bit more about that process and why some of it isn't right up to 2020 and everything like that.
No, that's a great point, Erica. Thanks for pointing that out. I think, we always design these projects and are hopeful that we'll get all of the data answers that we want. But I think we figured out through COVID how much of a challenge it really is to get post-COVID data, and we can kind of get some industry trends, obviously, throughout kind of currently to date, but some of the real impacts from census data on incomes is a little bit delayed. They did recently, kind of in the middle of this, release the ACS 2020 data, but unfortunately we didn't end up including that. There are some question marks about kind of some of the reliability of that data, just because doing those kind of surveys and that sort of thing during the pandemic were a little bit of a challenge. And also the kind of way ACS works with the kind of timing, it ends up being kind of a rolling average anyway, and includes some other years. And so for some of the broader kind of baseline analytics data, most of that really is 2019 data, ACS 2015 to 2019 data. Where possible, we tried to get as up-to-date data as we could through some of the more labor market data is as up-to-date as we can. There are also challenges, on the small business side of things with how you kind of cross-cut variables. For example, a question we keep getting asked is small businesses owned by people of color, but we can't really isolate that number. We end up looking at just kind of all businesses owned by people of color, which I think is still a pretty good metric. But where possible, we've kind of tried to kind of weave in more updated data where we can throughout the report. But if there's any specific questions on why we could include a specific piece of data or couldn't, we'll be happy to answer.
And I want to add on the piece about where there are places where people of color are thriving, and what is the why, what had happened. I think to get to the root of that, and one of the things that we have recommended and have come to a conclusion is the need for primary data, the primary research. And one of those elements is we've seen a great model out of Atlanta, Georgia, out of a partnership for Southern Equity, who's activated what's called the Just Opportunity Circle. And Just Opportunity is a way that they are engaging local employers and bringing them to the economic development table to identify like how are they looking at meeting some of these things that are needed to drive that community wealth building model, driving and looking at all community members to be a part of the solution. And one of those is how do we engage employers? So I think by figuring out ways of reimagining, and we touched upon this in the design justice session, is reimagining who is at our stakeholder tables and how do we convene that. And maybe that's an incremental approach of how do we have these soft conversations and create the space where we can start to find some of those solutions. So I just wanted to uplift that as an opportunity.
So some of that's already, a lot of that's already being done in our region through lots of different venues and lots of different initiatives. Thank you though, Jessica, it is a sound advice. Particularly, I think about the work that Hannah will be doing with Dawn around the inclusive workplace employer. If I got that right, that acronym, and it's a program through our state economic Department of Employment and Economic Development, DEED. That program is being really amped up and tried to work with private sector employers to help them become more inclusive workplace designation, and meaning that they would have those kinds of practices where they're thinking about wages and employee and onboarding and all those other things that we think about in this space. And so that's really great. The work that Stacy's leading with the SHED, the business accelerator in Brainerd, I think will address some of that modeling issue of what happens when people leave downtown and what kind of an economic impact is that for those that are doing remote working. So we are working with the city of Brainerd in partnership to create a co-working space. So some of those strategies really lean into what we're hearing, and the work that Stephanie leads with the lending, I think that's really important to have that access to capital. There are specific pools that are for minority populations that are only for minority populations. And so that's been great to be able to say that we are, really trying to look at making sure that that's not a barrier. Access to capital is not a barrier for entrepreneurship of BIPOC and other populations that are underrepresented. By the way, I understand and appreciate this was a racially focused and gender focused, but there are other populations like veterans and others that have lower participation rates in entrepreneurship than we would like to see for our region and for the demographics that we're serving. So, right, guys, I think some of those strategies bode well, but there's still work to be done.
I guess I would like to share something about the small business emergency loans that we did during COVID. and we did about 45 loans, and they had to report back on their revenue to be eligible for the forgiveness. And 98% of the revenue has increased from 2020 to 2022. So that's, I mean, I think that is such a positive indication. Granted, mostly restaurants, spas, things like that, but still, I mean, I was a little nervous, but when they started coming back in, the paperwork, mostly positive, I would say like 98%. So that's really good news.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And that is something that you know, a lot of our data that we did kind of looks at the peak of pandemic, but understanding those post-pandemic kind of trends are really interesting as well. And yeah, I did see, Tad, that you had a question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I could have jumped in. I'm sorry, but and the only really observation or comment that I had, and Amanda, you really already addressed it, was the census data. You know, from the fourth economy numbers, I saw that they had it was used from 2010 to 2020. And, you know, I guess from a local perspective, what we're seeing, you know, the post-pandemic numbers, and again, you already addressed this, but there's just such a new reality given the, you know, people are working from home and then they've decided to stay, is what seemingly all indications are. Some of the things to kind of back that up, I think we're seeing all emergency calls are up like 18% from past years. And so I think, so that was one thing I was going to question, like particularly from the city of Brainerd, the population decline. That I'm sure that may have been true from the period 2010 through 2020, but from post-pandemic data, I'm thinking that has changed. But again, you already addressed that. That's
a good point though, Tad, is that, do you think the population of Brainerd has gone up, or what do you think? In that
I think it's gone up. Yeah, I think
the last 2 years.
Post-pandemic, yes.
You think the city of Brainerd itself, like city limits, or outside of city limits?
Again, just anecdotal evidence, but based on, you know, emergency service calls and things like that, being up 13%, 13 to 18%. Just an
Do you
observation.
think that that's a result of maybe more, that's good questions. Is that because of more people, or is that because the population of Brainerd is older and needing more emergency calls as a result of boomer
I would
health?
think, I would think definitely more people, especially given that the, you know, region's an aging population, the county is an aging, Baxter's an aging, but Brainerd has a particularly younger generation.
Got it. That's helpful.
So I think, but again, that's just based on a few data points, and, you know.
I think that's important though, because one of the things that Angela's leading is we're seeking an intern to help us gather kinds of observations and qualitative data that can really put context, local context to some of this qualitative or quantitative data that you've showed us. So what are the stories? What are the observations? What are the testimony of the people here that could help us understand what the data says? And that local context is so important, instead of just, you know, we feel it is important that it's not just and thank you guys for the data. So I don't mean this in a disrespectful way, but it's not just a data dump. It's really to say, and your recommendations gave me so much excitement to see, but that we are giving local context to, okay.
Absolutely. Oh, sorry. I think I meant it interpreted. I think, you know, we always have, go ahead, Dan.
Well, I'm sorry. I just wanted, and I hesitated to even bring that up because, Amanda, you addressed that, like the post-pandemic data is hard to come by, and especially when the American Community Survey or the census, they do it on the rolling 3-year averages. So, you know, time will tell.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right in that it's hard to know kind of what has really happened with people in the last 2 years. It's kind of been interesting. I know we say post-pandemic, but obviously we're very still much in the pandemic too. But I think it would be interesting to see kind of how, you know, small rural main streets do evolve, even, post-pandemic. I think that while we can talk about, remote work challenging them, I think there are ways that it could create opportunities for rural downtowns as well, just because in rural cities, just as a way of, like I said, kind of disconnecting people from where they might be connected by place to a certain job. So I'd be excited in a year or two to dig into that data to understand how it might have changed. Yeah.
I am curious, I don't want to put them on the spot, but if you don't have any questions, that's fine. But two of our newer regional partners and or team members, Hannah and Danica, and if you're in a place you can't speak, that's fine. Were there any observations or anything you heard? Likewise, Brendan, you're newer to our region as well. Is there anything that you heard or saw that was like, that's interesting?
I did notice that a lot of our responses to the problems were, we are starting this. So that was kind of, I don't know, nice to hear that we recognize these problems and are figuring out ways to approach them.
Great. Yeah. Thanks, Hannah, for that comment.
One just maybe last question, unless anyone else has ones, but I was curious about, I know I've heard some of this before through our conversations, but like any trends, or maybe there aren't any trends as far as like our region compared to nationally rural regions specifically, if there's anything that is like similar across the US that you've seen or through the other regions you're working with.
Yeah, that's a good question. I might let Jessica answer a little bit. I will say between Region 5 and the other kind of rural region we have in our technical assistance portfolio, I think there are similar challenges. They're also kind of heavy agriculture industry, have seen a growth in Hispanic and Latino population as well, and are really kind of looking at how they support a very small business dominated economy as well. And so I think we see similar challenges for both regions. And so that's kind of a unique trend, even though you're in very different kind of areas of the country. Jessica, do you have anything you might add, share, just based on kind of community practice regions that you've talked to?
Statistically, no. I think just qualitatively, what I would want to share is that specifically when we're talking about rural geographies, there's not enough activation from either regional stakeholders or education institutions or et cetera that are focusing on inclusive economic development. So it's a little bit more difficult to put forward some of the solutions and to convene conversations around what is innovative for rural economies. Many of the cases is because there hasn't been enough in-depth work on just looking at rural economies specifically and how to think about them. They're thought of as a monolithic geography unit. And so that is something that we're uplifting, and not something that we can say we have found a conclusion because we're not the experts in that space, but really just putting a call to action that there needs to be more intentional work about defining what that looks like and uplifting some of that work. So I'm excited to see what Region 5 comes up with and following your journey along that.
Yeah, and I actually want to piggyback on something Jessica said, just in that, rural areas are very different from urban areas, and we do a lot of work in urban areas and they get a lot of attention, but thanks to Cheryl, I think she's challenged us to think about how rural places are different, and hopefully we can think about how to find specific tools that are useful for rural areas that might be different than what makes sense in an urban area too.
This is cool, Erica, and I just wanted to thank you guys for Erica was the one that said, Cheryl, we got to do this. I want to do this. I'm like, oh my gosh, another technical assistance provider that's going to behold all this lovely information for us. And you guys really hit it out of the park. So one, thanks, Erica, for pushing. And thank you guys for stepping up and doing really beyond what I had ever thought would come from these conversations. And so, so my expectations might have been tainted a little bit from previous experiences and brought many biases to the table. But thank you for proving me wrong and being really outstanding partners in this. And we're looking forward to figuring out what strategy we should be leaning into a little bit more and how we continue to do that with some assistance and great thought partners and I say this with respect, data geeks, because we do need to have data informed decisions, right? And this is helpful to help us do that. So just we're excited to share this at a commission meeting with not only our 22 elected officials and our commission, or maybe it's more, and the full corp, Stephanie's full corp group of private sector individuals. So we're super excited to share with NCEDA and Region 5 both, and with the rest of the region. And so that ends my gratitude.
Thank you very much. We appreciate this opportunity, and I'm excited to kind of continue into the next phase of the work.